This film needs explaining, doesn't it?
I don't know. Where do you think it needs explaining?
On your channel. As a matter of fact, I'm on it right now.
This episode of CPF Reviews is going to be a little different. Rather than focusing on reviewing or establishing the worth of a film or its ideas, I'm instead going to attempt to unravel and explain the subject matter, given that, excluding boatloads of European art cinema, Lost Highway is widely considered one of the most obtuse and confusing films ever made. Unlike the aforementioned art films, it presents itself in a familiar package, that of a noir thriller about marital infidelity in the tradition of James M. Cain. Indeed, Barry Gifford, who co-wrote the screenplay with David Lynch and whose novel Wild at Heart had been the basis for a previous Lynch film of the same name, described the story as Double Indemnity meets Orpheus and Eurydice. It sounds vague, but it's actually a fairly good description of the film. Double Indemnity is about a scheming femme fatale who plots to cash in on her husband's demise by playing a would-be Romeo for a fool, and the Orpheus story is about a man who journeys to the underworld to try and retrieve the woman he lost to no avail. Lost Highway tells its story in a sort of elliptical Mobius strip fashion, so I'll be jumping around in the narrative as I dissect it. I'm going to assume from this point on that you've seen the film, or simply don't care about spoilers. We open on a shot of protagonist Fred Madison looking thoroughly shaken and strung out by what we don't yet know, though it's very likely that the scene follows the murder of his wife. Fred functions as a sort of unreliable narrator, though this is not instantly obvious due to the lack of any literal narration. About 40 minutes in, Fred, upon supposedly discovering the murder, attempts to stand and is knocked back into his chair by a detective as the action suddenly jumps to the police station, suggesting that all that came before was Fred's account of what happened. Given that the film opens and closes with the David Bowie song I'm Deranged, one could infer that Fred should not be taken at his word. In fact, he all but admits this in his first encounter with the police, when he tells them, in reference to his dislike of video cameras,
I like to remember things my own way.
What do you mean by that?
How I remembered them. Not necessarily the way they happened.
This is probably the most important clue given in the entire film. Fred would prefer to remember an idealized version of events in place of the facts of the matter, and video cameras represent to him the cold, hard truth. Thus, what transpires during this portion of the film is likely to be Fred's garbled version of the events that occurred, wherein he attempts to exculpate himself from responsibility. Fred is roused from his shaken state by a message from the front door intercom, which informs him
Dick Laurent is dead.
He goes to look out the window, but sees no one, hearing only the sound of police cars and squealing tires. As an aside, this is based upon an incident which actually happened to Lynch.
The intercom buzzer went off early one morning, and a voice said, "David?" And I said, "Yes." And the voice said, "Dick Laurent is dead." By the time I got to the window where I could see out, there was no one there. Now, my next door neighbor, his name was David also, because I didn't know any Dick Laurent. And so I don't know what that meant.
It's not too hard to infer that the man realized he'd stopped at the wrong house and had hastily departed in embarrassment, but no such simple explanation will suffice here. Fred is married to Renee. This early scene, which likely takes place before the opening scene, establishes a strained, dicey relationship between the two. We see Fred as a man with little connection to the world around him. He seems to have no friends, no job that we're even aware of. His home is austere and looks barely lived in, and his attempts at satisfying Renee leave her bored and dejected. Fred barely lasts a minute, and that's for a scene filmed in slow motion. The only thing that seems to excite Fred is his saxophone playing. One morning, Renee finds an unmarked parcel containing a videotape on the front steps. Even though it too is unmarked, she's frightened when Fred finds her with it, as if she's already got some idea what might be on it. It features a shot of the couple's home, focusing on the front door. Grade A stalker material, and yet, after it abruptly ends,
Must be from a real estate agent.
She's relieved. What did she think was going to be on that tape? A second tape shows the stalker filming inside the house itself, prompting the call to the police, who seem instantly suspicious of Fred,
You want a video camera?
prompting his aforementioned expression about disliking cameras for what they represent about reality. At a party thrown by Renee's friend Andy, who seems chummier with her than her own husband, Fred has an unnerving encounter with a man in black who claims to have met Fred before.
Where was it you think we met?
At your house, don't you remember?
And claims to be at Fred's house at that very moment, seemingly proving it by answering when Fred calls home.
I told you I was here.
This, along with his appearance and dialogue, signify him as a representation of the devil.
How'd you get inside my house?
You invited me. It is not my custom to go where I'm not wanted.
We never learn this man's name or his identity, only that,
He's a friend of Dick Laurent's, I think.
unnerved by what has just happened, Fred makes a blunder at this point by blurting out,
Dick Laurent is dead, isn't he?
This confuses Andy, who, unlike Fred, is friends with Dick, and is surprised Fred would know of his demise when he has as yet heard no word of this news. Andy's expression as Fred rushes off tells all. The only logical reason Fred would know of this is if he had killed Dick himself, which we later learn he has. Never one to acknowledge his own guilt, Fred remembers it as something he heard, not something he did. But of course, who did he hear it from? Himself.
Dick Laurent
Is dead.
Returning home, Fred makes a search of his house to see if the party who answered earlier is still there. He sees no one, but hears his phone ring twice, just as when he called it, followed by a muffled voice. Despite this, he tells Renee no one is inside. As the couple prepares for bed, Fred suddenly wanders off through the darkened house as Renee calls to him.
Fred, where are you?
This scene was described earlier by Fred as a dream he'd had.
dream last night. You were inside the house. You were calling my name.
Fred is remembering this not necessarily the way it happened to avoid the truth. We see two shadows move through the living room before Fred walks straight into the camera, it seeming to disappear into his head, which then becomes the TV screen. In Fred's mind, what's about to follow is something he saw, not something he did. After this, Fred emerges with a third tape. Not from outside, but from somewhere in the back of the house, suggesting Fred himself was the source of the tapes all along. But this tape displays Fred having murdered Renee, who he seems to have remembered still being alive somewhere upstairs. As the song says, he's deranged. The police in the court have little difficulty accepting he murdered his wife, and having seen it on tape, he's forced to admit it to himself as reality.
Tell me I didn't kill her.
Sentenced to death, he waits in solitary as frequent, increasing migraines give way to hallucinations. A young man waiting by the side of the road, the mysterious man in black emerging from a cabin that seems to have been formed from a blazing fire. The next morning,
Fuck me.
Fred is gone, and inside his cell is a young man named Pete Dayton. Pete is, of course, innocent of Renee's murder, and thus is allowed to go free. In a rare moment of disclosure, David Lynch cited another inspiration for the film, O.J. Simpson.
Here is a guy who, at least, I believe, committed 2 murders, and yet is able to go on living. And Barry and I talked about that. How does the mind trick itself so that that can be put in a place where it no longer has that, horrific power, and you go on living?
This, then, is Fred's ultimate act of recalling events not necessarily the way they happened. He's no longer even Fred Madison. He's a young man living in the suburbs with his mother and father. Pete is almost totally dissimilar from Fred. He has a family and friends, is well liked by the ladies, has a job he enjoys, and a boss that likes him. Customers ask for him by name.
Where's Pete?
He's a far cry from the emotionally walled-off Fred, who is shooed off by his own wife at a party. The one thing Pete doesn't seem to like, jazz saxophone solos.
What'd you change it for? I like that.
Well, I don't.
In order to convince himself of this new reality, he has to shed himself of all traces of his past life. Deep down, he knows something isn't right. Friends and family cryptically reference something strange that happened to him recently.
You've been acting strange lately. Like the other night.
We're not gonna say anything about that night to the police.
But never articulate what it is. Of course, Pete can't remember it because he wasn't Pete then,
What is this?
and can't allow himself to remember the time before he was. The one thing he can't divorce himself from regarding his old life, however, is Renee, though he gives her a blonde makeover in a sort of reversal of Vertigo, along with a new name, Alice, which invites thoughts of disappearing down rabbit holes, and an insatiable desire for him that Renee never had. The catch is that she's the girlfriend of a powerful man named Mr. Eddie, who considers this to be an acceptable response to poor driving etiquette.
Don't you! Fucking tailgate!
This too is inspired by an actual event wherein Lynch was being tailgated on Mulholland Drive, of all places, and politely waved the offender past.
And I said to him, well, David, you're a nicer guy than I am. And he turned to me around and he goes, no, I'm not. I really want to destroy that fellow up there, but I just don't have time.
It turns out that Mr. Eddie is another figure from Fred's past.
You recognize that guy?
Yeah. Laurent.
This is the mysterious Dick Laurent, who brings with him another reminder of the past.
You like pornos?
Does that unboxed, unlabeled tape look familiar? Now identified as a pornographic film, is this what Renee was afraid her husband would find on the tapes that arrived at their house? We later learned she was indeed involved in the industry, appearing in films shot by Andy and produced by Laurent. Pete finds the idea off-putting.
No thanks.
As more of his old life resurfaces, his fantasy begins to dissolve. It's no coincidence that after picturing Alice's face, Pete sees a literal Black Widow crawling up his wall. Black Widow being a noir trope of a dangerous woman who exploits vulnerable men, such as Barbara Stanwyck in the aforementioned Double Indemnity. He then sees his room seem to blur out of focus as he looks up from the bed to his ceiling light, perhaps because it reminds him of something he's seen before. This defocusing effect will occur again as his spurned girlfriend Sheila implores his father to tell Pete what really happened.
Tell him! Tell him!
Sheila, don't.
Finally, Pete receives a polite and threatening as hell call from Laurent, who gives the phone over to a friend of his.
We've met before, haven't we?
I don't think so. Where is it you think we've met?
At your house. Don't you remember?
The conversation plays out the same as before, but with a different ending, as the film gives the most direct clue it ever will regarding what's really happening.
In the East, the Far East, when a person is sentenced to death, they're sent to a place where they can't escape.
Never knowing when an executioner may step up behind them
and fire a bullet into the back of their head.
The mystery man is reminding Pete that he's in jail, cannot escape, and is awaiting execution. Afterwards, Pete's parents, who have been standing and watching this bizarre phone call, have suddenly vanished. We won't see them again. The fantasy is coming unglued as the truth begins to resurface. Alice also begins to change in his mind. She tells him of how she became involved with Mr. Eddie, but over the course of the story, she goes from seeming frightened and victimized to being confident and in control, even as the situation worsens. Pete's attempt at idealizing his recreation of Renee are failing, because he doesn't believe she was an innocent victim, but a willing participant.
Why didn't you just leave? You liked it, huh?
Things don't improve for this picture when, as they attempt to rob Andy, another figure from his old life, Alice shows little emotion when things go terribly awry.
Killed him.
You killed him.
Seeing her dispassionately robbing the corpse of a man she had previously described as a friend makes Pete feel ill, and he stumbles off and into a bizarre hallway lined with numbers, where he finds a vision of Alice taunting him.
Did you want to talk to me? Huh? Did you want to ask me? Why?
Fuck are we going, Alice? Where the fuck are we going?
We have to go to the desert, baby.
Harkening back to more devil mythology, Pete must meet his adversary in the desert, in the cabin he saw in his earlier vision. In any normal film would at some point see this cabin explode in forward motion, but it never occurs here, as if, as previously suggested, it's being formed from the fire, another clue as to the identity of its sole inhabitant. Though now quite clear on the fact that he's been used, Pete doesn't exactly triumph over the temptations thrown his way.
You still want me, don't you, Pete? More than ever.
He still won't give up on his dream girl until she tells him quite bluntly,
You'll never have me.
and with that, the Pete persona has finally failed, and he's now Fred once more. Alice disappears into the cabin, where only the mystery man will be found subsequently, and it won't be the first time the film has conflated Fred's paramour with him.
Here I am.
Still, Fred tries one last time to hold on to the alternate reality he's created.
Where's Alice?
Alice who? Her name is Renee.
We see that the man in black is the one with the video camera, or more importantly, the one who's the voice of the unvarnished, ugly truth.
And your name? What the fuck is your name?
Fred runs from the sight of the camera as if the man was brandishing a weapon as he literally tries to outrun the truth. The memory that had begun to resurface in Andy's house now comes back to him. He found his wife and Dick Laurent having a tryst in the Lost Highway Hotel and kidnapped and killed Laurent, but not before revealing he knows about Laurent's past with Renee and Andy, something he had suspected for a while. So who is the mystery man? He seems to be partnered up with Fred, though sometimes he's there and sometimes not, as if he might just be a figment of Fred's imaginings. He gives the impression of a figure of pure evil, as even though he's introduced as a friend of Dick Laurent's, he shows him no loyalty. He seems poised to give Fred an alibi for Renee's murder by setting up a false narrative of a stalker, only to stab Fred in the back by filming the murder itself. Is he just a function of the truth as it tries to break through Fred's delusions, or was he based on a real person, such as a detective or a hitman hired to find out the truth about Renee and assist in her killing, one who was lying in wait at the house the night of the party? Was he that mysterious second shadow in Fred's house on the night of the murder? Is he a Mephistophelian figure who promises rewards but seems ready to renege on the deal, condemning Fred to a cycle of trying and failing to achieve what he desires?
There's things that have to happen, information that has to be given for the thing to go, and the mystery man, provided that. To say with words anymore would not be good.
You didn't really think it'd come clean on that one, did you? As for co-writer Barry Gifford, he opined that, I don't think it needs an explanation at all. It was never meant to confuse.
It's nice to know I can still make you laugh.
Yeah, that is a good one. The film ends where it began, with the message delivered into the intercom, followed by the sound of squealing tires and sirens, as Fred, like the mystery man, seems to be in two places at once, riding past himself on the Mobius strip of his cycle of failure, either in some metaphysical hell or simply within his own tormented mind. We close as Fred seizes again, possibly beginning the cycle anew, or possibly for a far more prosaic reason.
Fred Madison, here's my order that you be put to death in the electric chair.
So that's my take on what's happening in Lost Highway.
I like that.
Am I 100% sure that this really is what's happening in the movie? No. While I think it's a solid way to read the film, the fact is that the penultimate scene actually throws several entire boxes of tools in the works, where we see the detectives working on Fred's case appear with the two detectives following Pete in the same scene as they investigate Andy's death. It's not clear where in the course of reality this is meant to have happened, though the party guest being questioned in the background suggests that it was later the same night, perhaps after the death of Renee. The cops seem to regard what's happened as if it's literally what took place, noting that arrival for the affections of Fred's wife seems likely to have been killed by Pete, and concluding,
I think there's no such thing as a bad coincidence.
Is this suggesting that Fred actually turned into Pete, as well as relived certain parts of his life so as to end up back where he started? This could be part of Fred's continuing delusion, but why would he be imagining events in which he played no part? On top of that, Lynch's original screenplay features a few more scenes with Andy which occurred after Fred's arrest but before his transformation into Pete, also somehow suggesting a more linear order of events. While one might argue that ultimately cut scenes don't really count in determining the course of the story, it's worth noting that Lynch cut the scenes for pacing reasons and not because he felt that they simply didn't make sense within the narrative. Perhaps in the end, the entire film is Fred's fractured recollection of events, both true and imagined wholesale. After all, it closes with the same song that opened it, suggesting all that came between was in fact deranged.